Welcome to our July 2020 webinar from ACU Idea Lab. We're grateful you're able to join us today. These webinars will be recorded and available on our Idea Lab YouTube site, which will be emailed to you at the conclusion of today's session. On our main website, acuidealab.com, you can also learn more about what we do for professional development. If you would like more information on our online degree programs, please visit acu.edu/online. All of our online degree programs are designed for working professionals like yourself. Today, we will hear from Dr. Peter Williams and Dr. Lori Tucker, who I will introduce momentarily. I'm Noelle Awan, and I'm your host this afternoon. You will notice that all participants are muted and hidden, but there will be opportunities to participate in today's session using different functions found at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please use the chat for general intros, comments, and questions for Idea Lab. We will also utilize the chat today to answer some audience questions. When you do, be sure to click the drop-down window on your chat and choose all panelists and attendees so that our presenters can see your responses. As you've seen in the past, we will also utilize the poll feature, which will pop up on your screen to participate in. If you do have specific questions for our presenters at the end of today's session, please use the Q&A feature. And let's begin using the chat with everyone sharing their name and the city and state they're joining from. Here is today's agenda. Dr. Williams and Dr. Tucker's presentation is Can Abrasive Bosses Change? Insights from Those Who Did. I will close this out no later than 12:45 with some next step items, and we welcome anyone who would like to stay after for a Q&A with Peter and Lori. Feel free to post any questions you think of during the presentation in the Q&A, so that we will have those ready at that time. During this webinar, you will become acquainted with two leaders and their stories of growth, and you'll understand the importance of others in the leader's development. Now, I'd like to introduce our presenters sharing some of their expertise with us today. Dr. Peter Williams has a PhD from Texas A&M in Human Resource Development, and I believe he may be teaching there in the fall as well. He has led and been led by many, and he has taught adults for over 30 years, including research for leaders in doctoral programs and English as a second language for seminary students in Honduras. He does applied research on how adults learn, lead, and work in online blended and multicultural environments. Peter has consulted and trained internationally on leader development, designing online learning, and program planning. He enjoys coaching leaders, roasting and drinking coffee, cooking, and learning to be a Texas master naturalist. Next is our guest ACU Online alum, Dr. Lori Tucker. Lori earned her EDD from ACU Online in organizational leadership. She is an executive behavioral coach and a college instructor in the subjects of organizational ethics, managing workplace conflict, and leading organizational change. Lori has 30 years of experience leading and promoting positive organizational change, including being a multi-state operations manager for a regional insurance company. She is a member of multiple international associations where her research on formerly abrasive leaders has been accepted for presentation. Lori resides in the Pacific Northwest, where she enjoys being outdoors, either gardening or simply enjoying the natural beauty of the area. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Peter Williams and Dr. Lori Tucker.
Well, thank you, Noelle. Peter and I are pleased to be here, and we are glad everyone could join us today to hear from two formerly abrasive leaders. So please just sit back for about 15 minutes and listen to Vincent and Jimmy tell their stories and reflect on their journey. Visualize their experience, and as you do, ponder the characteristics of these leaders or other aspects of their stories that stand out to you. So before they tell their stories, we have a chat question for you that you can see there for you to think about. What key characteristics stand out to you in these stories? So use the chat feature and be sure to click on all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu so everyone can hear your comments or see your comments. So first, let's hear from Vincent. Hello, my name is Vincent, and I am the CEO and president of an insurance company. About 5 years ago, 3 board members approached me saying, "We have to address your conduct." I was terribly embarrassed that they had to speak with me, not about poor performance. My performance was wonderful. They needed to speak to me about poor conduct, how I was treating my coworkers. I acknowledged to them that the destructive behaviors they were describing were accurate. Well, at least 95% of them. And obviously, this criticism was bad. But I just took it all in and asked, what do I need to do to turn this around? I was fearful my behavior had gotten too bad, and the board members were only looking to fire me. I wondered if they would give me a chance to turn it around. And I was scared. If given a chance, I may not be able to. The board members immediately imposed several requirements. I was told I had to engage with an executive coach, reduce the number of external board commitments, obtain a physical, provide the board members with mental and physical health records, adhere to twice a year 360 evaluations, and increase the number of one-on-one dialogues with the 3 board members. It was tough to hear of these demands, but I was happy to demonstrate there weren't any physical or mental issues. I signed off on all that stuff. I just really wanted to get better, and I really, really wanted to turn this around. Even with this rough conversation, I got the sense the board members wanted me to succeed at changing my behavior, even though they had to give me that hard-hitting feedback, and they even refused to fund my normal annual bonus. They wanted to support me in my change and development, which was really important to me. So as I think about it, after 18 years of being a servant leader at this organization, I experienced a disconnect in 2014 and some of 2015. I now refer to that time as the 18 months. Historically, we met or exceeded our annual goals. And, so some board members wondered if the goals were just not sufficiently difficult. So I responded with ambitious initiatives for 2014. Naturally, my executive team felt compelled to attain the goals, but they significantly stretched the capabilities of our human resources. About this same time, my commitments to the community increased. I was an active member on 16 boards of directors, one of them being the State Board of Education, and I was the chair. I had built up a reputation, you see, as someone who can make things happen, so I got asked a lot to serve on boards, and I just couldn't say no. Ultimately, I felt bombarded with negativity serving on these boards. And then I was bombarded at work with all of our goals. I was compressed for time, and then all of that negativity was just thrown at me. It kind of made me into, and the only thing I can think to describe this is a teapot ready to blow. I realize now I put a lot of stress on myself that spilled over to the lack of emotional control and a lot of negative interactions with my coworkers. I became progressively angry and short with my executive team. I increased my swearing. I was even providing individual critique during team meetings that was only appropriate in private. I was aggressive when people didn't meet deadlines, and if they made a mistake, I went after them in public. I was aggressive when people didn't meet those, when they made mistakes, and I publicly berated them. I was spiraling out of control. I could see it even creeping up. I was seeing myself almost in my own movie, losing my cool. So I had some, or maybe even a lot of self-awareness. I could see it, but I didn't make any changes. And actually, at the time, I believed the solution was to increase my external commitments, which sounds hard to believe right now. Those 18 months were intense for me and unknowingly to me, my coworkers. Well, the board hired Dr. Lee as my executive coach. She specializes in helping abrasive leaders. I gave her permission to interview about 20 people as part of the 360 assessment. She then reported her findings to me. First, she named many positive attributes. Then she went into all the negative behaviors, the spin cycle of repetitive accusations, the public humiliation, the perceived threats, the total lack of emotional control. And it went on from there. The comments were in the actual words of the employees. It was devastating. The feedback was difficult to hear, but it was only with this feedback that I began to see how bad and pervasive my behavior was, and that it possibly impacted everybody in the company. This feedback opened my eyes. It was obvious I had to get to work. Well, the coaching lasted about 9 months and involved several conversations with Dr. Lee, who was brutally honest. She put a mirror right up to my face. I had caused great harm and I didn't even know it. With her help, I learned a lot of people management strategies, especially those that help people become accountable without me losing control. I also learned a lot about the importance of emotional intelligence, which is now top of mind. In addition, I made infrastructural changes, which were particularly helpful for me in remaining more patient. Well, Dr. Lee conducted a second 360 about 9 months later. And I knew from the first report there were deep issues, and I wondered how that second 360 would turn out. I thought it would be positive, but I wasn't sure. I anticipated there would still be some negative comments, and I was relieved to find the second 360 was much better. Actually, it was like day and night. There was, here and there, a comment where someone would say, I thought Vincent was about ready to lose his cool, but he didn't, or something like that. But it reinforced to me that I am, and I'm not using this pejoratively, I was being examined under a microscope. So I learned people were afraid of me and my anger. My coworkers were walking on eggshells. If I looked like a teapot ready to blow, they were cowering in the background and they wouldn't give me the honest information I needed. My abrasive behaviors negatively impacted the effectiveness of the company because people were fearful of me and they avoided me if they could. As I reflect, it seems we were just trying to do too much. I am totally 100% accountable for my behavior, but we were sometimes almost victimized by our own success. Because we year after year accomplished our goals, the board said, you need to create more challenging goals. Ultimately, we created a ton of challenging goals, which we all felt compelled to make, but it just wasn't humane. Next, we will hear from Jimmy.
My name is Jimmy. I'm an orthopedic surgeon and I've practiced medicine for 32 years. I do all kinds of complex surgeries, and I continue to take call and fix broken things. After medical school, I enrolled in the military where I practiced medicine and taught residents at the military medical school for a few years. After leaving the military, I went into private practice with 7 or 8 other doctors. Then, about 14 years ago, at the end of the monthly partner meeting, the senior partner excused everyone except me and the other physicians from the boardroom. The room went quiet, and the hairs went up on the back of my neck. My heart rate jacked up. I started to feel anxious. My radar screen is blipping, something bad is coming my way, and sure enough, I was on the agenda, but didn't know I was on the agenda. On what I call 5604, which was May 6, 2004, I got called out by my peers for bad behavior. The senior partner said my lead surgical nurse and physician assistant reported 2 incidents to the group president. I had said something inappropriate, and I had shoved a coworker. You know, I remembered those incidents, but they weren't a big deal to me until that very moment. Immediately, I became defensive. It came totally out of the blue. I asked myself, why are they doing this to me? I've never been called out or criticized in this way, ever. It was a shock. I couldn't talk or even hold my coffee cup steady. I was angry and embarrassed. I just got up and left, went to my office and shut the door. I had to cancel my clinic the rest of that day. I became so emotional. I thought, how dare you call me out for that? I was sitting in my office later thinking when I realized, yes, I have to make a change. It was a defining moment. I then called a developmental program for physicians at a major university that I had heard of. The program started with a 3-day on-site session and then several full-day follow-up sessions. I was there with other physicians and we all worked together. We did intense reflection, group discussions, role plays, and a family of origin genogram. The genogram was especially painful. I mean, thinking about growing up, I had a lot of shame and guilt in my youth, and that would just drive me to be better than everyone else. The next 6 months after the 3-day session were a critical part of my growth. Right after the initial 3-day course, we did what they call the 360 assessment. I chose people to assess me who knew me well, who would give me honest answers. When the results arrived, I didn't want to read them. And sure enough, the results were painful. The feedback really opened my eyes. I realized that people saw me as abrasive, and I saw myself a complete other way. I saw myself as a hard worker. I always tried to show respect. I had been a star pupil my entire life. I was a military officer, made it to lieutenant colonel with commendation medals. That level of performance is what it takes to be a doctor. I never abused anyone. I never abused my kids. It's not who I am. That's not me. I don't shove people around. I never saw myself as an aggressive person. I actually try to avoid conflict. Making sexually inappropriate comments and jokes, that just isn't me. Or so I thought. But it was. Another part of the program was to do some assignments. One of them was right after the initial 3-day session. I spoke with the managing partner. I was nervous and scared. You see, I had this newfound wealth of knowledge about myself, but I was a novice at it. Apologizing for my bad behavior was all new to me. But I didn't want to be abrasive anymore. I just remembered that I had to thank him for having the courage to confront me about it. You know, that one-on-one conversation was probably the hardest thing for me to do as part of the program. After that, I apologized to my lead surgical nurse and my physician assistant. I felt terrible about hurting them. I had to own up to my sins, so to speak. At the end of the 6 months, I also addressed everyone else in the practice to apologize in a more public way and thank them for supporting me along the way. At the end of the program, there was another 360 assessment. Again, I was afraid to read the results. What if I hadn't changed? But actually, this time the feedback was positive. I had improved, and I discovered I viewed myself more in line with how others viewed me. Now, it's been 14 years since that intervention, and that's what I call it. My partners did an intervention on me. Through this journey, I have added tools to my toolbox. I can identify triggering events. I have anger management skills, communication skills, empathy, emotional intelligence, and the ability to understand both sides of things without me being reactionary and confrontational. I've also learned what drives my own behavior. I worry a lot. I have a deep fear of failure. I also struggle with anger, and I'm learning to take a step away. I've learned a lot about myself. I realized I wasn't aware of my own stress and frustration. Now, my behavior was wrong, just plain wrong. But what got me in trouble was a lack of self-awareness. The journey analogy, I think, is a good one. After 5604, I never did those behaviors again, but even now, I have to be very careful. The most unexpected aspect of the journey is how difficult it has been. I had to be vigilant all the time. I was constantly monitoring myself. It took a lot of energy. Over time, it got easier. For me, the journey will always be a struggle, though. The journey never stops, really. What key characteristics stood out to you in these two stories? Some of you have jotted a few things down in the chat window. Feel free to go ahead and make note of other things that you notice. And make sure you pull down the drop-down menu and select all panelists and attendees. As we look at those comments, next you are going to be shown 3 slides to read as we consider some research findings about psychological aggression in the workplace.
The harm from psychological aggression in the workplace is simply undisputed. It is known as a global phenomenon, directly impacting, some researchers say, about 15% of the working population. There are numerous ways of labeling those who use psychological aggression, such as toxic leader, abusive supervisor, or simply the workplace bully. In a recent study, we sought to hear from leaders who had once used abrasive behavior. What would these leaders have to say? Well, let's first define abrasive behavior. Well, Dr. Crawshaw defines abrasive behavior as any behavior between the executive and coworkers that creates emotional distress sufficient to disrupt organizational function. So this is not just any annoying or otherwise inadequate behavior. It is sufficiently poor behavior that causes the organization to stop or reduce its focus on its mission. Well, you might be wondering, well, what kinds of behaviors are abrasive? Well, Dr. Crawshaw, again, after working with several hundred abrasive leaders, noticed that there are 5 most common behaviors used by these leaders. So the top 5 are over control, condescension, threats, overreaction, and public humiliation. You probably noticed some of these behaviors by Vincent and Jimmy. And maybe you have noticed some of these behaviors in your workplace. Maybe these behaviors are acceptable where you work, and maybe they're even encouraged. However, if the behavior causes sufficient distress among coworkers where production is decreased, organizational citizenship is reduced, or people are focusing on their own woundedness or their boss's horrific behavior, and not the mission of the organization, then the leader could be behaving abrasively. And that behavior is destructive to coworkers, organizational culture, and productivity, not to mention the abrasive leaders themselves. So we have a polling question here for you. In the past 12 months, have you experienced any of the following abrasive behaviors at work? If so, which ones? Choose all that apply, and we will look at the polling results here in just a moment. So please continue entering responses. Oh, so we've got 2 here at the highest, 63% for over control and condescension. Seems to be a pretty common occurrence. Oh, actually 3, sorry. Didn't have my trifocals lined up right. Overreaction. Those are the top 3 that we're seeing here, with public humiliation next and threats being felt last. Thank you for sharing your feedback with us. So Peter is now going to offer some insights that we've learned from these leaders.
In this study with 3 formerly abrasive leaders, we found the journey away from abrasive behavior involved the narrative threads of disruption, awakening, and equipping. The threads are not sequential stages, they are woven together and co-occurring. I'll briefly explain and provide examples of each narrative thread. Disruption was intense and emotional. It was both an event or series of events, each at a particular point in time. For example, the intervention, also the immense stress, and the 360 assessments. And it was also a continual ongoing process. The disruption was having their world shaken. Their sense of who they were and what was important, their values and beliefs, were shaken, if not shattered, causing disorientation, confusion. The disruption included high stress from before the intervention and difficult changes in behavior and corresponding values after the intervention. Awakening refers to the increasing awareness of self and others. It happened in light bulb moments, but it was also a very gradual dawning that stretched over time. Awareness of the depth of harm on others and of the extent of harm on the organization. It included growing awareness of their own blind spots, self-awareness, and it was often made real, made tangible or concrete in the very disrupting assessments. The equipping included a lot of learning, growth, and development. It too was ongoing, woven together with disrupting and awakening. The skills they learned related to emotional awareness, to observe their own emotions instead of being consumed by their emotions, and emotional regulation. These were complex skills to learn, requiring coaching and practice over time. The leaders had to have supporting people around them who gave honest feedback and encouragement, and they had to have expert coaching and counseling. They were confident they could learn the skills in general, but they couldn't do it alone. The journeys involved all 3 threads of disruption, awakening, and equipping. These threads are woven with each other, co-occurring as these leaders over time changed their behaviors. Organizational capacities and responsibilities, the importance of others. Now we're going to shift focus from looking at the leader to considering the organization's capacity and its responsibility. With each leader, superiors intervened. Several of you noted that in your comments in the chat window. They offered honest feedback. Their coworkers and colleagues offered feedback through multiple 360 assessments. And specialists were hired outside the organization to offer coaching, training, counseling, and the assessments. And these leaders were provided an opportunity and the resources to change. They did not grow through this in isolation. They grew being surrounded by others.
Now we have another chat question. What is one thing you can do based on what you've heard here to help prompt your organization to deal productively with abrasive leaders and other abrasive employees? Please click on the all panelists and attendees as you respond. We're seeing lots of good comments here from the other chat question as well. Let's see here. Okay. And we can talk more about this when we get to the question Q&A section of our presentation. So we now want to fill you in a little bit more on their stories, and we'll first hear from Jimmy.
About a year after the 5604, the intervention, I moved to another part of the country where I was asked to be in a leadership role with the group practice and at the hospital. Within a few years at the hospital, I became the medical staff president, and the following year, I was named Physician of the Year by the entire staff of the hospital. That was a big deal. Being chosen by the people I worked with at the hospital, being selected to these leadership roles means that other people now see me positively. I have come a long way. The intervention and training have just helped me understand who I am, who I was. It helped me understand my evolutionary journey. I am at a much better place now. I want to be remembered well. I don't want to be remembered as that abrasive guy.
And this is Vincent. The infrastructural changes were quick to implement. However, learning new management skills of keeping my cool when someone wasn't performing was challenging. But I've learned new tools and I've improved my emotional intelligence. And currently, our executive team is humming. No one left the organization because of the 18 months. But I did realize that I had deeply hurt 3 people on my leadership team. Mending those relationships took much longer than I had anticipated. But right now, it's been a few years, we are doing great and we are better than ever. To be honest, I continue with the executive coach 5 times a year, once each quarter, plus an ad hoc meeting when I believe human challenges might get me down. But through all this, I've become a better person. And I want other leaders to know they too can recover from abrasive behavior.
These leaders were put on notice by a superior that their abrasive behaviors were no longer acceptable. The leaders then began the arduous journey of personal development. The journey caused tremendous disruption as they were awakening and equipping themselves to be better leaders. The journey also included improved interpersonal behaviors, emotional intelligence, and management strategies. They, however, did not go on the journey alone. Their journey involved others, superiors who intervened, coworkers who provided honest feedback, external professionals to the organization who provided coaching, counseling, and training. The involvement of others was vitally important to the leader's growth. Positive change is possible. We have learned from these who did.
Thank you so much, Peter and Lori, and we will open it up for Q&A shortly. And while you're thinking of questions for our presenters today, you will see a link posted in the chat for anyone interested in finding out more about our online degree programs. You will receive an email within the next 24 hours with a recording of today's session, and the follow-up email will also include a brief survey, which we would appreciate your feedback as we continue these webinars in the future. We would also like to invite you to ACU Online's Open House webinar next Thursday, July 23rd at 6:30 p.m. to learn more about the online undergraduate and graduate programs offered at ACU Online. We're also posting a registration link in the chat for that event. If you do have further questions, feel free to email us at idealab@acu.edu. And we want to sincerely thank everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Peter and Lori for sharing your knowledge with us. We will now open it up for Q&A, so feel free to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window.
Thank you, Noel. Lori, we see several questions coming in.
I see the one from Maria about personal development is key, but knowing where the journey begins is vital. How do you start the journey? Or how does one begin a journey? Caring for self versus caring for others. Well, I'm going to put that in perspective of our leaders. These leaders were unaware. They were blind to their own behavior, their impact, mostly blind. They could see there was a sense of an awareness, but not clear awareness. And in the case of Jimmy, the doctor, he was completely unaware, never again thought of his abrasive behaviors after he had attacked a coworker or said inappropriate jokes or pushed somebody out of the way. So it has to be brought to their attention in the terms of these abrasive leaders. Very rarely will an abrasive leader actually reach out for help. It's normally somebody above them that's going to hold them accountable for their behavior, that they've kind of put that line in the sand that we're no longer going to accept this behavior. And there'll be consequences, possibly with dismissal from the organization. I don't know that that answers your question, but for the participants, there were 3 in this study, it had to be made clear to them that poor behavior was no longer accepted and that there would be consequences and they were being held accountable. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I think one of the keys is the blind spots, that most of us do have blind spots. And for some leaders, it's and mid-managers and leadership comes from all areas of the organization, but it's necessary to get the feedback that helps reveal the blind spots.
Other questions or comments?
I would just follow up on Maria's question about caring for self or others. In the last maybe 15 years or so, organizations in general, some more than others, have become aware of the need for people to exercise self-care and encourage it. But not all are like that. And sometimes it's just words. So you do have to take responsibility for your own self-care.
Thank you, Peter. Deanna has a good comment here. I also think it's helpful for leaders to have their own accountability people in their lives to help identify some of those blind spots. And with our leaders, these were people who were super achievers. I mean, they couldn't just get, 99% on the test. They had to get 100% plus all the extra credit, and they accomplished tremendous amounts of work, and they expected that out of themselves. And so they're so hyper focused on the achievement that everything else is kind of peripheral to them. And there's that continued blindness theme. It's in the shadows, and they're not aware of those things. So in this case, it had to be the superiors to these leaders to hold them accountable, that possibly a group of peers maybe wouldn't have had that same impact. And in case of Vincent, it certainly didn't, because I didn't say it here, but he had one of his peers come to him, but he didn't acknowledge or make any changes at that time. So, but I don't think it hurts, certainly, to have peers who help us become aware of those things we're missing. Thank you, Deanna.
So Kathy asked, what is the role of organizational culture in the transformations? And that's that's a really insightful question, because the organizational culture contributes both to the dysfunction and has to contribute to the recovery. And the way many organizations contribute to the dysfunction is by overvaluing technical performance and undervaluing the relationships. So it's a hyper emphasis on task performance and neglecting quality relationships. So, but the organization as a whole had to value their people enough to provide resources for recovery. So these were leaders of value to the organizations, but they had to invest in them. So they were not viewed in organizational culture. The people, these leaders were not viewed as fixed resources. They were viewed with, there was this organizational growth mindset, you might call it, where, yeah, you're abrasive and it's got to change. There is no choice, but you can change, and here's some resources that you can use. So Kathy, I don't know if that addressed your question. Lots to talk about there.
So Catherine asks, would you consider abrasive when a leader appears to be not wanting to accept suggestions? Is that still viewed as a blind spot? Good question, Catherine. These leaders, except for maybe Vincent, he had some level of awareness. The others two, and others that I've heard about, even after the intervention, even though that's so disruptive to their self-identity and is really troublesome to them, they're not believing still that they have an issue, that there's a big problem with them typically. The real change where they think, okay, I've got to do something about that, is with that 360. That is where they move from being blind to now seeing, because oftentimes they're very dismissive when one person, such as a peer, comes to them and wants to offer them some feedback. Or oftentimes these leaders have been called into HR, maybe even numerous times, but again, they're dismissive of it because, well, it's the coworker, or, well, who made that comment, and they're just not a good worker, they're not a team player. So they excuse their behavior as though it does not exist. They are truly blind to it until that 360 comes back, and it is devastating, because they're involved in selecting those people whom they trust to give them that feedback. And when you have 15 or 20 people criticizing your lack of emotional control, you're berating people, and you're just blowing blowing steam and you're condescending, and it's multiple people and it's characteristic of how people see you, you no longer can deny that there's a problem that you need to fix. Most of the time, that is when the awareness happens. Does that answer your question? So it doesn't surprise me that somebody might not become aware or think that there's an issue when one or two or three people approach them, especially if they're peers or subordinates. But it takes this intensive disruption for people to, in the case of these leaders and some other abrasive leaders I'm aware of, for them to make changes. It's not something that's delicate. It's rough, and the organization has to be ready to do that, hold them accountable.
And Peter and Lori, I do see a couple questions in the chat that may not be visible to you. One question here is, which behavior change model is suitable for abrasive behavior change?
I'm not sure what's meant by behavior change model. One of the things that Lori did was compare their journeys to the model that Jack Mesereau and Bob Keegan have put out. That they have two separate models, but it involves a disorienting dilemma. Those are Mesereau's words. And then subsequent reorientation to the world. So it's a mental schema that has to be disrupted and reconnected to new views of reality. So I'm not sure if that even comes close to addressing the question, but if you can ask a follow-up, I'd be glad to, or maybe Lori has some ideas.
No, I wasn't quite sure either what was meant by behavior change model, but yeah, in this study and in the dissertation, we talk about and use the conceptual framework of Keegan and Mesereau and elements that they shared in looking at how people develop just in general. So, and what we found here is very similar to some of the ideas that they present. The idea of being blind, that you have to become aware. That's present in both of their theories. We saw that very clearly here, this idea of blindness and overcoming blindness.
And another question here is actually for those working with the abrasive leaders. Gail said, were there any tools of support for the employees who were verbally and mentally abused by the actions of their leaders?
Good question. I am not, that was not part of this study, and so I am not aware of what the organization did in support of those employees that were on the receiving end of abrasive behavior. My guess is people felt just so relieved that the organization was taking some action, and but I am not aware. I am not aware of any tools of support for the fellow employees. Kathy Yeager has a question in the Q&A. What is the role of organization culture in the transformation? I just have one or two thoughts, and maybe Peter can follow up on that. Without the leaders above these abrasive leaders, this probably would not have happened. And as Peter said earlier, and Peter, did you address this question earlier? And I just...
Yeah, it's the same question that Kathy posed in the chat. But I mean, I think that what you're saying, I don't think I said, the need for those above these, even executive leaders, to step up and have the courage to confront a very high performing member of their organization, but one whose behavior was disrupting at the same time.
Yeah, these are exceptional. I mean, these are not just wonderful workers. They are exceptional, enormous drivers of productivity. Um, uh, and so it takes the leaders above those abrasive individuals. They have to be at a place where they're ready to let that person go before they're going to do anything about that. So, like Peter was saying earlier, you know, sometimes the organization helps create what then becomes a problem. So it's important that the organization take a look at its own culture and its own contribution to creating this environment.
Okay, does it look like that wraps up all of our questions? I think it does. So to respect everyone's time, we will go ahead and conclude today's session. If you have further questions, please email us or visit our website at acu.edu/online or acuidlab.com. Thank you again for joining us today at ACU ID Lab, and we hope you have a blessed day.
Thank you, everyone.